Wow, first of all, what an amazing turnout on a random afternoon. I know there's pizza because they're good organizers. But it's wonderful to see you all. It's really great to be here. Wonderful to see a veteran Brookline educator, the mother of my best friend, Franny Moyer, here in the audience, and so many faces, new and old. Really great to be here. So Max has had me on a little dog and pony show today. I got here early this morning. I live in New York City. I got here early this morning and met with the incredible Massachusetts Teachers Association staff, and then went over to the State House and had a pretty remarkable event. It was in the old Senate building, the old Senate room, with all the, Calvin Coolidge and Horace Mann and the Senate president and 12 or 13 senators came with a whole bunch of other people on staff, and we talked for about an hour. And it was really clear that I think coming on the heels of the ballot initiative victory for Mass Fair Share, which I remember talking to people in Massachusetts about 15 years ago, that the idea of really refunding public education from the cradle through to debt-free college is having a moment in Massachusetts. And that is only for the good of this state and for the nation, to see how we can begin to reinvest in public goods again, reinvest in our educators, our helpers, our caregivers, and of course in our youth. So congratulations to all the people in this room who helped to make that happen and bring this moment into being today. So I just want to applaud all of you. So this afternoon, I wanted to just share a few of the lessons that I learned on the journey that I took ultimately to write The Sum of Us. I didn't set out to write a book. I set out with a big question on my heart. I was a public policy wonk. I worked for nearly 2 decades at a think tank, using research and statistical analysis to spot problems in the American economy and then craft evidence-based policy solutions, and hope that in getting those to the desks of policymakers and decision makers in business, that they would make better economic decisions. That was kind of the formula, right? And I'm not saying it was totally futile, but way too often we had all the data, all the white papers and the statistics, all the evidence, all the bleeding heart stories, that inequality was growing, that 1% of the population owned more wealth than the entire middle class, while nearly half of working adults couldn't make ends meet for things like housing and food. We had the data about the rise of inequality, and we even had the data about how inequality was actually bad for growth. I think for a time when I began my career, there was sort of this bipartisan kind of sense that, well, yes, we're minting more and more millionaires and billionaires every day, but that's gonna trickle down to the rest of them. But even the people always laid intellectually to the party of reality, economists, we're beginning to finally have to admit that inequality was even bad for growth. That if you don't have enough of your players on the field scoring points, your team is not going to win. And that we simply can't be competitive if so many of our families are mired in debt, are held back by disadvantage and discrimination. And there's so much concentration in our economy that we can't have as many new small businesses and entrepreneurs and innovators who aren't already at the top of big mega corporations. And so I was a bit frustrated, and I set out to answer not how our economy had gone from one that was shaped like a football with a fat middle class in the middle and sort of narrow ends of high and low income households on either side. And I knew that we had gone from being shaped like a football to being shaped like a bow tie. right, with a squeezed middle class and bulging ends of high and low income households. I knew that looking at the economic data, and I knew why, right? I knew how it happened, right? I knew how we had gotten from 1 out of every 3 workers being covered under a collective bargaining agreement in the 1960s to today, less than 1 out of 10. I knew how we had gone from being a society where the minimum wage was enough to feed a family and was about half the median wage and had a high watermark point in the late 1960s to today where the federal minimum wage is $7.25, where it commits you to poverty. I knew about the changes in our tax policy and trade policy and labor policy, but what I couldn't understand, and my studies in law and economics simply did not give me a compelling answer to, was why. Why would the country that had figured out the formula for something we call the American dream be willing to turn its back on that formula? And so I set out to meet hundreds of people, talk to organizers, a lot of them in organized labor, grassroots organizers, faith-based organizers. I picked up the phone, I hit the pavement, I went to diners, I joined Facebook groups, talking to hundreds of people, and then also broadening my intellectual foundation from the disciplines that I have been trained in to think more about the social sciences. And what I ended up learning is 3 core insights, and I just want to share them with you very briefly today. The first is that our collective economic progress is being held back by a lie. And that lie, that fallacy, is the idea, as Jess said, of the zero sum, right? Of the idea that there's sort of a fixed pie of well-being, and if one group gets a bigger slice of the pie, then the other group has to get a smaller slice. And in the US, that zero-sum story is a racialized one. It's racialized because many folks believe that progress, or even the presence of people of color, is a threat to white people that has to come at their expense. It's also racialized because according to the research, white Americans are far more likely to view the world through a zero-sum prism. Now, I thought that was really interesting when I first came across it, and I did something that I would end up doing more and more on my journey, which is sort of pausing and really asking deeper questions, right? Because you can sort of take something like that and chalk it up to just like, oh, zero-sum thinking, that's just something white people do, But no, it's not like there's some biological correlation between the melanin content in your skin, right, and the tendency to view the world through a zero-sum prism. It's not natural. Everything we believe comes from a story we've been told. And so I said, well, who's telling my white brothers and sisters the story about the zero-sum game? Who's selling the story to them? How are the people selling that story profiting from the sale of that story economically and politically? Right? Who gains economically when working and middle class people are divided from one another? When they don't live near one another, when they're not willing to share with one another, when they're not willing to organize with one another, when they're looking upwards, aspirationally, because everybody can get rich, as opposed to looking laterally at their fellow person in struggle. Who benefits? And it was really in trying to understand the whole extent of the zero sum, about what it's cost us as a core foundational story in our history. And for those who've read the book, you know that each chapter includes a little bit of history. And I am not an historian. I wear many hats, but I am not an historian, but I really did feel like one of our big problems in society is that we have been woefully miseducated about history. We don't know where we're standing today because we refuse to look at the steps that we took to get here. And it has been actually a campaign throughout our history to win the memory war of how we got here. And so I wanted to include a fair amount of history and look at where the zero-sum story came from. And ultimately, it was a creation of some of the worst elements in our founding society, right? The enslavers, the colonial plantation elite, who sold a racial bargain to the many white, soon to be considered white, Europeans who were also landless and in various levels of indenture, and said to them, side with your color instead of your class. And it's that racial bargain that we've seen the self-interested elite try to deploy time and time again throughout our history. So when I think about the zero sum and what it costs us, it really ended up leading me to the second big insight in the book, which is the story of what happened to many of the country's nearly 2,000 lavishly funded, grand resort-style public swimming pools. So these public swimming pools were not the kind that I think you and I normally think of when we think of a community pool. These pools often hold thousands of swimmers at a time. And they were part of a building boom of public goods, right? Public roads and bridges and libraries and schools and these pools. And this building boom was in the 1930s and 40s. It was part of the New Deal era of public goods. It was those kinds of physical public goods, but it was also economic public goods. Economic public goods like Social Security for the elderly, like a massive investment in housing, a federal investment in housing that working people could afford to make sure the supply kept up with the demand of the workforce. And on top of that, something really heretofore unprecedented, which was the idea of mass homeownership. You have to remember, it was a pretty radical experiment in the New Deal era to say that just your average working person should be able to have a government-backed, regulated, and insured financial instrument, allowing them to, on modest incomes, own a piece of property that they would then be able to, of course, pay off over time, but that would create a foundation for intergenerational wealth. This was really reflecting that deeper public goods ethos of the era. It was an ethos that said, you know, the government has a right and a responsibility to ensure a decent standard of living for her people. That public goods ethos was also reflected in the GI Bill, which put a generation to college for free and into no down payment home ownership, and the labor laws of the New Deal era, right? The wage and hour and safety laws, the collective bargaining laws that helped to swell the ranks of organized labor. And that, in turn, helped to create the greatest middle class the world had ever seen. Right? The highest standard of living in the world in the 1950s. And yet, virtually everything I just described was in one way or another racially exclusionary. Whether it was explicitly or just in practice. So we had the Social Security Act, which in a compromise with the Jim Crow delegation to Congress excluded the two job categories that most Black workers were in. Right? So only Black people would have to still toil in domestic work and agricultural work in poverty until they died. That massive investment in housing I referenced was predicated on the never substantiated idea that people of color would be too much of a credit risk. And so the progressive FDR New Deal government created as a condition of subsidy to private developers that they include racial covenants. Okay? Clauses in the contract saying that these new homes that were affordable would only be given to people, quote, wholly of the Caucasian race. This wasn't just in the Jim Crow South, this was all over the country. It was federal policy. We saw the creation by the federal government of the maps, the redlining maps, as they are now known, which surveyed all of the greatest metro areas of the country down to the block level for their racial and ethnic character, designating the areas with a, quote, high Negro concentration to be hazardous for lending, thereby barring private lenders, commercial lenders, mortgage lenders from lending in those areas, leaving those communities who nonetheless, by hook or by crook, were able oftentimes to buy property, to open businesses, but they were doing it with loan sharks. They were doing it with contract loans. They were doing it at such a cost and did not have access to the capital that helped to create thriving neighborhoods that were resistant to economic shocks. So we saw all of this, even the GI Bill, which was race neutral on its face, where were the benefits, right? They were in the very segregated housing sector, right? And an education sector. And even the labor laws didn't do enough to help workers of color because of widespread job discrimination and, shamefully, a lot of exclusion, racial exclusion from labor unions. But that all began to change in the 1950s and 60s, right? When we began to see that the civil rights movement allowed Black families to successfully sue with the argument that their tax dollars had funded those public goods all along just as well, right? And that in the case of the swimming pools, which were so often segregated all over the country, either with a whites only sign on the fence or just by custom and enforced through intimidation and violence, that their kids should be able to swim too. And that's when desegregation orders for public swimming pools began to come across the country from federal courts. And in response, many towns and cities, instead of complying and integrating, decided to drain their public pools. They literally drained out the water, backed up trucks of dirt and gravel. And when I saw this phenomenon, I went to Montgomery, Alabama, and walked the grounds of what used to be 1,000+ person swimming pool in their central park called Oak Park. Gone, January 1st, 1959. Montgomery closed the entire Parks and Recreation Department of the city. No more public goods. They even sold off the animals in the zoo. And they kept it closed for a decade. We were in 1970 before there was a Montgomery Parks and Recreation Department. And they still never rebuilt the pool. But this didn't just happen in Montgomery, right? It's like, oh, Montgomery, you know about Alabama. No. Right? This happened in Ohio and West Virginia. It happened in New Jersey and Washington State and California. In many places where they didn't just, baldly destroy the public good rather than share it, they just kept meaningfully segregated pools, right? So the white families refused to go to the pools that Black families were now able to go to, and the towns often stopped investing in those public goods once they were integrated. Some towns and cities sold their public pools to private membership clubs who could then have a roster of who was invited. The YMCA was actually a regular partner in these schemes. One of the strangest moments in my book tour was when I got a phone call, a media call from, I think it was called Backyard Swim and Spa. And Backyard Swim and Spa is the name of a trade magazine for the people who sell, service, install backyard swimming pools. And they wanted to interview me because they were doing a cover story, a sort of racial reckoning about when their industry really took off. And it was in the wake of public pool integration. Right, so you see what happens? Racism destroys public goods. It means that if you're wealthy enough to build a backyard pool or join the country club or the private swim club, you figure it out. But everybody else has to make do on their own. Go without. And the story of going without is one of the stories that I tell in the book because it's so much a story of the America that I've known, right? Of going without the debt-free public college that we used to have back when 90+% of the college-going population was white and mostly male, right? We used to have debt-free and free college, not because it didn't cost anything, but because government picked up the tab. And then we began to drain the pool of public resources around state legislatures investing in their public college systems and maintaining that level of support and maintaining the affordability. Right? So what do we have now instead? And we're all at the bottom of a drained pool around public college, where we have a $2 trillion student loan burden in this country, where 6 out of 10 white students have to borrow, 8 out of 10 Black students have to borrow. Our college completion rates are beginning to stagnate globally, when we used to be at the head of the pack. We turned our backs on a formula that worked. It worked, it wasn't charity, it was an investment in the economic engine that is the next generation. And so that's why the movement across the country for debt cancellation, to say it was a mistake. This debt for diploma system is no way to run a country. We need to liberate our most diverse, most prepared and educated generation to live out their dreams and solve our big problems and not be paying interest to the federal government and to rapacious lenders. That movement has grown. And it's also why the movement to refund public schools and the promise of public education, from universal childcare to pre-K to robust public funding in every single neighborhood for K through 12. And then, of course, to return to debt-free public college, that movement has grown as well. Because there is a growing sense that destroying public goods has hurt us all. Everyone but the very wealthy and self-interested elite. So Max mentioned the solidarity dividend. And for me, the idea of the solidarity dividend came to me as I started to think, well, okay, if racism in our politics and our policymaking is creating all of these roadblocks to progress on all of these different issues. In the book, I talk about how it's contributing to our unchecked challenge of climate change. My voice is hoarse right now because I spent 2 days breathing New York's air from the massive wildfires in Canada. Racism contributes to the financial crisis that we are still seeing the impacts of today. Racism contributes to our broken democracy, to the lack of integration in our neighborhoods that costs us all, right? All of these different areas, of course, including the poverty economy and the way in which racism has been used as a wedge to divide working people from one another and to divide working people from the labor unions that used to be such an integral part of making decisions in our economy and helping to build a middle class, right? There are all of these different issues where there's this kind of common thread, racism in our politics and our policymaking. And oddly enough, the more I saw it, kind of hiding in plain sight, the more I began to feel optimistic, not pessimistic. Because I felt like, well, okay, there are all of these issues, kind of basically like all of the big policy head scratchers in our society. And we're not making progress on any of them fast enough, but there's this common thread of racism. Well, if we just pull on that thread, then progress on each of these issues would be closer at hand. And because it really has always been about collective action. The most important things in life I can't do on my own. Right? I can recycle all I want. I can't address global climate change on my own. I can read to my son. I can't make sure that he has a well-funded excellent neighborhood school on my own. I can't teach him anything, apparently, on my own. Right? It takes educators. It takes a well-supported public good. And so as I began to think about this idea that it would be through collective action, and in a multiracial society like ours, with its history of racism being a wedge to block us from collective action, it was going to take multiracial collective action, intentional multiracial coalition building, but then we would be able to unlock these dividends, right? Real gains, higher wages, better funded schools, cleaner air. I began to see evidence. It was a theory, and then suddenly it was everywhere I looked. And so in the book, The Sum of Us, which, as many of you know, is now adapted. It's really just a third shorter for middle and high school students. And then later on, a year after it came out, I went back out on the road and collected even more stories only about solidarity dividends, only stories for the podcast, The Sum of Us, that are just stories of hope and cross-racial coalition building, how people were able to come together and win. And now that I do this work of looking for stories of solidarity dividends, because I do believe, right, that everything we believe comes from a story we've been told. So we've got to tell our fellow Americans the story of how we win. Right? We've got to say that this is a big experiment, a radical experiment of multiracial democracy done in the shadow of the multi-generational lie of white supremacy, right? The stain of slavery and genocide, and the lie of the belief in a hierarchy of human value. But we are trying to make something different here in this land of ancestral strangers. We're trying to make a democracy where diverse rooms can come together and say, I see myself in you. We do not have the same background, but ultimately we all want the same things for ourselves and our families.
That's it.
And so I'm gonna say that your fight is my fight, and that no one should fight alone. That's an old labor motto, and I think it's a great one. The idea that no one should fight alone, because ultimately our fates are linked. That is what solidarity means. And it's time for us to reinvigorate this idea of cross-racial solidarity, which is in some ways some of the hardest solidarity you can seek to build. Because it has to be about community. And to have community, you have to have trust. And to have trust, you have to tell the truth. You have to tell the truth about our history, about how our neighborhoods came to look the way they do, with the inequalities that we see every day. And you have to be willing to deeply listen, empathize, organize, and create a vision that unites people across different backgrounds. But you all are doing that. The Max Fair Share campaign was that. I remember when it was impossible. And we're seeing that in so many places across the country. And so I wanna leave you with this vision, with a vision of a world in which we truly invert this tacit pyramid that we have had of who really matters in our society, where we say that the people whose main source of income is opening an envelope to see their stock returns are at the top, that they're worth more because they have more. And near the bottom, we have the people who care. The home health aides, the paraprofessionals, the bus drivers, the nurses, the janitors, the public servants, somehow end up being on the bottom of this hierarchy of human value when they do so much more for so many more. The job of educating a young person is the hardest and most important job that there is. So let's stand together. Let's fight for one another. Let's invert that pyramid and say that everyone deserves a living wage and nobody deserves to feel the stain of indignity and poverty, and the least the people who care for our next generation. Thank you.
Wow. I know we just applauded, but we have another round of applause. Right? And my role today is primarily actually to moderate a conversation, and I know you all have many questions. But let me start first by telling you who I am and why I'm here. So my name is Nick Jurovich. I teach history and labor studies at UMass Boston. And I'm a proud member of the Mass Teachers Association, FSU MTA. We are a pre-K through PhD union, and it's such a privilege to be a part of a union where your union president gets up and says, fighting for paraeducators, the gains we've made are some of the greatest gains we've made in the last decade. I have been researching the history of this work for the past decade, and if you told me 10 years ago that a major teacher union leader would get up and say that, it would have blown my mind. And it tells you, I think, how far we've come as an educators union movement, led by folks, including those right here in Brookline, who put these issues on the table in the last decade, and how we might continue to move forward. So thank you to BEU for hosting us, and thank you all for being here too to have this conversation. The reason I'm here is that actually back when I was a graduate student, I got an email from Jess who said, our paraeducators are organizing for living wages, for job security, for respect here in Brookline. Woo! Yeah, right? All workers deserve it. And I found something you wrote on the internet where you say, Byron Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, these titans of the civil rights movement, 50 years ago, were fighting with paraeducators for living wages, for job security, for respect on the job. And I said, yes, that's exactly right. And of course, these civil rights organizers, these labor organizers, were fighting in exactly the manner Heather McGhee tells us we need to, simultaneously advancing a broad vision of economic equality. Their signature vision was the freedom budget for all Americans, but in the same breath, naming it as a project of racial justice, advancing this as a vision for uplifting all workers, and particularly those workers who had been left out of that New Deal contract. So briefly, what happened? There was a baby boom in the post-war era. Schools were overcrowded, and administrators, backed by elite foundations, said, well, we can hire more teachers, but they're expensive. What if we hire aides? Mostly women, in cities, mostly women of color. They can do all of the kind of care work functions that need to happen in a classroom while our teachers stand up front in front of 50, even 60 students, right? Oh, and by the way, we'll pay them about $50 a week. That was the going rate, poverty wages. And along came civil rights organizers, those affiliated with the war on poverty, and labor organizers, and said, wait a second, look at what these educators, and they are educators, are doing in schools. They're bringing local knowledge into classrooms. They're connecting schools to the communities they serve. Oh, and by the way, they would make great teachers. What if we fight for those things? And under the tutelage, actually, of Byron Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, organizers in New York City, all around the country, began fighting, and they won enormous contract gains. So by the way, when you hear someone say, wow, 30% for paraeducators seems like a lot, the first contract in New York City raised para wages by 140% in 1970. We need memory, right? We need to remember these things. All around the country, these wages went up, so that by the late 70s, the wages that paras were earning, inflation adjusted, would be what our educators are asking for today if we actually make those 30-40% leaps. Back when Minneapolis teachers were on strike, I actually did the math, and the paras, they were demanding, basically being brought back up to the level they were in 77. So again, if people tell you this sounds outlandish, this sounds new, it's not, right? These are demands that have been articulated before. This is a vision of broad economic advancement and racial justice. But why are we still fighting for it? What happened? As we learned from Heather's book, and by the way, I'm a historian, and this is great history. I want to be clear about that. Insofar as the credential matters, this is fabulous. And I want to be clear about that because the pool was drained, right? And we know this happens in public education. Some of it's explicit, right? We know how the austerity logic is deeply tied to attacking both the people who need public services as welfare queens, as takers, and the people who provide them, right? And this language, as you write, seeps into our speaking about public servants all the way up to Scott Walker's attack on educators in 2010 in Wisconsin, the Tea Party's attack all around the country. And so when you hear people today telling paras in Brookline and elsewhere that they're temporary, right? Not interested in the knowledge they bring in, but wanting to test them only in English, even though they've been hired from communities where that's not the first language spoken, right? We see these issues coming up in contract fights. This is a long project of austerity, of drained pool politics, of zero-sum thinking. But after 2010, our unions began to rethink this. For a long time, teacher unions on our back foot went along with this idea that we had to conform to austerity, that we had to advance a logic of elite professionalism. But that's changed, right? That's why you hear our educators standing up and saying fighting for paras is essential as part of our entire union, right? Because we have to advance all of our members, because an injury to one is an injury to all.
Yeah.
And when we see that today in Brookline, right, we are fighting for the kinds of vision, right, that one job should be enough that has been advanced by the Fight for 15 that Heather writes about, by Marriott strikers down the street a few years ago. We can link these things broadly to that campaign, both for racial justice and for economic equality. These kinds of visions will hopefully, I believe, bring about those solidarity dividends that Heather writes so eloquently about. And so, as someone who's studied this history, I'm inspired by what you all are doing here in Brookline. And what I want to do now is ask our Brookline educators to come up and sort of model our process for this discussion by asking our first 3 questions. We thought we would take questions in batches of 3, and in so doing, sort of allow Heather to process a handful of questions, offer some comments broadly. So we'll ask our Brookline educators to ask them first, and then we'll open the floor to all of you. We're also going to pass around cards for those who prefer to write a question rather than ask it. So I think we'll be at this microphone, and I know we've got like 3 folks to kick us off.
Can you guys hear me?
No. It's on.
Sorry about that. So first of all, I just want to say thank you for everything. What you've said is incredibly inspiring. My name is Amanda, and I'm a Spanish teacher here in Brookline, and I'm also a member of the BEU. I'm a proud Latina working in a department with the greatest proportion of teachers from other countries, and for whom English is not our first language. We represent a lot of diversity, and yet when a Latina student, 3rd grade, enthusiastically grabbed my hand when I walked into her classroom and told me that she wanted to be a Spanish teacher one day, it broke my heart to find myself asking if I could support this. I wouldn't want my Latinx students to work in the conditions that we are now working in. Last week, the administration told us that they laid off K-8 world language teachers, and the rest of us will have to do the work of those they laid off on top of what we're already doing. Full teaching loads, plus more, for the same pay. What do you think this says about the district's priorities?
My name is Deborah Morales. I'm a member of the Power Contract Negotiating Team. I'm a MECO advisor. My job is to support families. Some don't know that we are the source of wraparound services for our students and families' needs. One of the barriers I'm struck by this year is that we have been coming up against the fact that we do a lot of good work in this district. We really care about the kids, but we're not valued. I've been in the district for over 10 years and I've advised many clubs. And suddenly I've been told, if you want to keep doing this, you have to do it for free. How do I continue to work here when I'm feeling devalued and at odds? I question my why. Is education a place for me? I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Hi, I'm a para in Brookline, and 1 in 3 paras quits every year, either because of lack of pay or because we get moved around, just treated interchangeably. And I'm wondering how we continue to connect that to the bigger picture that you're talking about.
So I just want to say thank you for coming and sharing those stories. It's so important that the work that's often rendered invisible and less visible, gets really highlighted. Because you ask any student whether or not world language matters, whether or not paraprofessionals matter, whether or not the enrichment activities and the wraparound services matters, and they will say absolutely. And they often are what are keeping young people engaged and connected and able to actually stick through at a very challenging time to be a young person. Right? And so why it's so important that a union, which again, I think it's great, Nick, for you to really put this into context. the idea of collective bargaining has always been an unalloyed good in American society. But labor unions, leaders, strategies, et cetera, right, you can't say the same, like any institution, right? We have had our moments that have been great, our people who have been great, our strategies that have been great, and we've had less of them, right? But to have a union, oftentimes, the more expansive the union is, the more you begin to see that hierarchy, right? Where who is prioritized are the people who make the most, have the most social capital and economic capital in the union. And so the fact that the most visible demand and fight is here at the BU and in other places across the state is to make sure we raise the wage floor and make sure that the negotiations that you are doing are successful, is to make sure that the beating heart of the educators' workplace, is still there. Because we know that if you are paid too little, if you are made to do work off the clock, if your, contributions and your talents are disregarded, you do not stay. And this actually is, this kind of attrition ends up costing the district, ends up, creating chaos for the young people and for the other educators who have to start over again. And it's really, really important that, because if my understanding is correct, the minimum wage does not apply to municipal workers, that there be a living wage and then some for every worker, right? I would add, no matter what their status, in a community to make sure that that is a thriving community.
So we have 2 microphones and the floor is open. Please feel free to come up and ask questions.
Thank you so much for being here and sharing your work with us. I'm from Springfield. I'm also a world language, so muchas gracias. I teach French, German, and AP African American Studies. So one of the things that was missing here, I think, is that our students, I think, are the ones who are losing, this battle. And something's going on in Springfield, I think, all over, maybe the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, all over this country, is that a lot of teachers are walking out, and it looks like my district is just looking for warm bodies to fulfill a position, whether they're qualified, whether they're educated, have the degree or not. They're just looking for warm bodies, to fulfill these positions, and our kids, I think, are the ones who are really suffering. So I just wanted to add that also to the equation.
Absolutely. Thank you. These positions that are undervalued, they're not just undervalued, they've been under relentless attack. Right? I'm sure we have some Mr. Rogers fans in the room, right? And he said, look to the helpers. And it really does feel like it has been a concerted economic and political strategy in the past few years to attack the helpers, right? To sow chaos in our public school systems, in our public libraries, to wage wars against science and healthcare that make nurses and caregivers and doctors on the front lines of ideological battle. We are experiencing massive burnout in exactly the professions that we've been most. So I think what you're talking about is really real. It is affecting educators and caregivers across our society, and I think it's not an accident because these are very unionized professions. These are professions where people tend to have progressive values, and they ultimately are professions that are related to the public good. And so, whether it's the book bans and all of that, what we've seen is a real strategy to sow chaos in public goods and institutions that support the public good, to try to drain those schools. Unfortunately, it's not popular, right? Like all of this anti-science, anti-learning, anti-freedom to learn, anti-healthcare rhetoric, which is, much louder than it should be, is not the majority of the country. I was just in Florida on Monday, and I wasn't sure whether I was going to go, but I went. I was like, if people want me to come, I will come. And even in Florida, where there's been just tremendous attacks against educators and librarians, and immigrants and LGBTQ people and women, I mean, the list goes on. None of those things is popular, right? 66% of the voters of Florida are opposed to the book bans and the abortion bans and the Don't Say Gay bills and the immigrant bans, like all of them, right? And so you really have to recognize that it's about democracy, it's about organizing, it's about us realizing that there is a majority support for the kinds of values we're talking about. And we've got to take some comfort in that and not be, and not let them, make us despair, which is the goal, right? To create chaos and despair.
My question's a bit different. So I'm Bitsy Perlman. I'm a town meeting member, which means I'm elected in the crazy pants system of government that Brookline uses. I'm also an economist trained as an economic historian. And so I've been thinking a lot about these New Deal programs that you talk about as, being purposely excluding Black people in a sort of compromise way to get the Southern Democrats on board, right? Like these were compromises that were made. But I've been starting to wonder how much they were not actually just compromises, but in fact designed to create a white class that was actually more, engaged in racism, specifically through home ownership in that way. And through not providing things public good, but through employers to sort of create these divisions. And I guess my question is, when we think about expanding the pie, how much should we lean into these systems that may or may not have been created to divide people? Again, like investing in home ownership, versus trying to sort of undo these systems. And I guess, how can we think about which ones are worth saving? Yes.
So cool. So I definitely think that there is a lot of evidence that creating these divisions was good for the northern capital class as well as the southern capital class. That's pretty incontrovertible. But your kind of more interesting, provocative question, I think, for the present moment is, so much of the average American family's wealth is tied up in home ownership, and the home ownership, has been shown to make people more conservative in a lot of different ways, right? It's like, oh, if all my wealth is in this property, if you even suggest that something might hurt my property values, then I'm gonna suddenly go against all of my whatever ideas I might have had before, because I gotta keep my nest egg, right? The stand your ground kind of castle ideology, right, comes attached to this idea of private ownership of land. And of course, we should not, but we do, tie the funding of our schools to these property values that have been rigged racially deliberately. So there's a lot of, I think, reason to be suspicious of home ownership as a part of that equitable path forward. Now the problem is, what we have is a massive racial wealth divide that is most acute for Black families who were left out of that free stuff and the subsidized ownership. And that means, that has a real impact on today's families, right? So today, a Black college graduate has less wealth, household wealth on average, than a white high school dropout. And that makes no sense, right? It just flies in the face of everything we know of economic success, right? The white high school dropout shouldn't be wealthier than the Black college graduate. And yet, wealth is where history shows up in your wallet, and where Black college graduates done everything that she's supposed to do. She went to college, she graduated, she has a good job, she's got a higher income than the white high school dropout. But the one thing she can't do is go back in time and make sure that her grandparents weren't redlined out of home ownership, right? And when we talk about home ownership, it has been free money, unearned wealth, and opportunity and security for generations. And so if it's not going to be a system of home ownership that creates the economic security of a middle class life for this more diverse middle class, it's gotta be something else. Because I'm not convinced that I think we need many renter protections, and it needs to not be a huge financial penalty to rent, right? And we need to have renters be protected from rising rents the way that homeowners are protected from rising mortgages, right? Like our mortgages don't go up unless we've got, an adjustable mortgage, but that's a very small percentage of people, right? So we need those kinds of protections, and housing shouldn't be a casino, but we also need something. You can't say, I don't think we could say, okay, let's stop subsidizing home ownership, let's stop encouraging home ownership now. Like, that would feel very painful, actually, right? To say now that most, young people are people of color, let's forget that, like, free stuff.
Hi, Heather. First of all, thank you for being here today, and thank you for all your work in all of these areas. My name's Annetta Argyris. I work at the same program where Nick teaches. I'm a staffer in the Labor Resource Center at UMass Boston. I'm also the president of my MTA local there. So here's my question for you. I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but I'm curious for you to talk more about the intersection of the zero-sum mentality and the corporatization and privatization processes that we're seeing. I know the K through 12 world faced this, in the manifestation of the charter school movement. In higher ed, we're also facing it in a myriad of ways of both the lack of public investment, but also wealth extraction from what should be a public institution. So I'm curious how you've seen as an economist, how you've seen in your conversations with people, this interaction of these thought processes around the zero-sum game and corporatization and financialization of our public institutions.
A couple others? Oh. You're good.
Hi, my name is Emily. I'm a Brookline High alum and a future history teacher. I'm in college right now. So one thing that I've been thinking a lot about hearing you talk, haven't had a chance to read the book, but doing education justice work in Philly, where my school is based, thinking about this conversation contextualized and situated in Brookline, which is a very wealthy district. And and you talk about solidarity dividends, what does that look like intra-district? Thinking about what does it mean to have this struggle, have this fight in Brookline that has a lot of resources, has the means to do this, when districts just, walking distance, take a TN, don't have those same means to make that. What is it? How does solidarity operate in between districts, and how does that fight look like?
Hi, Heather and Nick. I'm Justin Brown. I'm a fourth grade educator here and the incoming president of the union, so I'm really excited to be here. I was also one of the organizers for this event. We have a bunch of RSVP questions. I have a group of 3 here that are sort of related, but do you want to sort of talk about these?
I'll ask you.
Okay, nice, got it, okay. So, I do, think that, it's hard not to be sitting in this building and, be here on this gorgeous campus, and not see that not every student in the Boston area has this opportunity. And so one of the things that we're trying to do by talking about the solidarity dividend is to say that, there's a chapter in my book called Living Apart, which just talks about these issues. It just talks about the problems of segregation in K through 12 education and segregation in housing, and how it ultimately ends up having a cost for everyone. That the logic of Brown v. Board of Education was not just that it was bad for little Black kids not to be able to go to white school, but that it was bad for white kids to be going to white segregation academies too, right? And that there is an educational imperative to integration, true meaningful racial and socioeconomic integration, and that there's a civic imperative to it as well. So, I do think that so yes, and in practical terms, I think that's where, institutions like the MTA have to come in, right? Where there has to be campaigns, as there have been, to get more resources to the whole system, and to make sure that those resources are distributed equitably, and that we are making sure that we narrow those gaps, and that some of the, not just the funding dollars, but also the resources in terms of the facilities, the student groups, the educators get shared. And there's more of a sense of comity between the different districts and the different institutions. And that, nobody in any part of the city doesn't feel like they could never walk onto this campus and experience, what is here, and vice versa. And I think that can easily be a win-win across that economic divide. And to the point about privatization, listen, there's a lot of money in public education, right? It's like, oh, I hate government, unless I can profit off of it, right? And so, it's been very clear at the K-12 level, and certainly if you look at, how a lot of public institutions of all kinds end up spending their money, there is a lot of wealth being extracted from the public purse. And just like with charter schools, which were promised to be better and have not been shown to be better, oftentimes the outsourcing, the privatization, is the same way. And so I think that it's about the zero sum, but it's really about draining pool politics. It's about this assumption that private is better. And that, the private sector can run things like a business and do things better, which is not always borne out. And what is certain to me is that the people who are benefiting financially from big contracts and using public resources for profit gains are going to profit. Like, that is guaranteed. Whether or not there's better service improvement, certainly not guaranteed. And then it's what's usually guaranteed is that the people doing the work will have lower wages, less of a pension, etc.
Hi, I'm a former Boston Public School teacher. I taught for almost 30 years in the Boston Public School. I am always hired. If you guys want to wait before you clap. I was hired with several other teachers of color under the Arthur Garrity's decision 30 years ago. And I'm kind of leery when I see unions, because the Boston Public School Union was not helpful at all. In fact, when we were hired, they tried to appeal Judge Garrity's decision, and they lost. But, and also, the joke was going around that they were using Black and brown teachers' union dues to pay to fight against them. And I saw it for 30 years of the union not helping teachers of color. And they say it's because more teachers that are not of color in the union of teachers. So they help the ones they work for. And I was just wondering, how would you, I mean, you may have answered it already, but if they see that they're gonna lose, if they feel they're gonna lose, then how can you get them to change their ways? If they feel that the other teachers are gonna lose pay, when we were hired, about 350 teachers that were not of color were laid off. And that didn't even reach the 20% that they were supposed to have. And I just want to know.
Great, thank you. Thank you for sharing that story. You know, when I was talking about how these institutions have just been reflective of people, that's exactly what I was talking about. I mean, I was raised, very much in the inequality era and focused on class struggle, class politics and economics, and so I've been very pro-labor, and my parents were like, what are you talking about? Right? It's been the unions who stop Black people from getting the jobs, the apprentice job, right? So, that's just really real. And it's important to tell that history, a part of that labor history, and it's important to have repair, right? It really is, because, because otherwise you have many communities that should be right here, front and center, labor activists feeling like this is not a place that is welcoming to them. So not to put anybody on the spot, but I do think it's worth it maybe for Max or Jess to talk about kind of how today's union has dealt with or has evolved from the racial strife of you don't mind? I was gonna stop. There you go.
I actually was gonna also ask Nick to talk about the drain pool that happened in Boston in the 70s, that right after these jobs were created, that then the funding got cut. I think the crucial part of what's changed in the MTA and the Brookline Educators Union is democratic unionism and democratized bargaining. And you don't have a strike with 1,150 people without having 1,150 conversations, one-on-one, about what is important and what people are striving for. And there is no shortcut, and you do not have strikes unless all members, and you've heard us talk about the world language teachers. I just want to make sure you take a look at this, 700 statements of solidarity with the world language teachers in K-8 for their super exploitation. And our ESDR para campaign, which is of course the largest proportion of staff of color within the district. And all I can say is it's thanks to the fierce determination of people of color to press unions and of unions' readiness to have the humility to do what you're saying that is transforming this movement. And it's done one struggle, one campaign at a time.
I'm waiting to speak here.
I think he's been waiting to speak for a while.
Yeah, we'll come back. Great.
Good afternoon. Arthur Conquest, resident, parent of two students that graduated from Brookline High School. I wonder how many people in the audience here remember Dr. Adrian Mims.
You're here.
Okay? I just want to put a pin in that. How many people remember the demonstration last March in front of Brookline High School with about 1,500 students protesting the racial treatment that they received at the hands of the administration, and publicly made the administration, the principal, apologize to students? I want to know how many people remember that 5 senior Black female administrators have left this system recently, okay? No explanation by anybody in this town about why those Black women have left this system. There's never been a report about those 1,500 Black students that demonstrated in front of that building. This is on us. We're allowing this to happen. And it's going to continue to happen until we organize ourselves to say to the power structure, the white power structure in this town, that's it. No more. It's up to us to have that happen. There's no, my heart bleeds for Dr. Adrian Mims. 18 years of his life. I think about that often. I remember the day Adrian Mims came to this school as an aide with the Medco program. He started from the bottom. And when he got to the top, thank you, but no thank you. It's on us. I don't care if it's 3 of us that have a sit-in at that high school or have a sit-in at the school committee to say no more.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions that were part of our RSVP process, and these are, I think, coming from educators here at EHS. They're all sort of related. The first was, where do you see, Heather, the best work being done in schools to build humans who are thinking in non-zero-sum ways? That's from Julie James.
Oh, get it, Julie!
This is from Laura Honeywood. Where can I find this succinct explanation of the solidarity dividend that I can provide to students as they search for solutions to the ways racism continues to hurt us all? And the final from Abby Erdman. What are the most important changes to upend structural racism in schools?
Oh, easy one.
That's another hour.
Well, I want to say that to Arthur, I'm sure he will be here for people to talk to afterwards to create that organizing. That's how it all continues. The solidarity dividend is the idea. There is the output, right? What you gain, right? It's the result of cross-racial coalition building. And so in the book, there are some stories of solidarity dividends. The podcast, as I said, is entirely stories of solidarity dividends. And then we created a companion guide, an activist companion guide for the podcast, knowing that for a lot of people, students included, the audio was going to be more engaging to them than the 400-page book. And that what's great about the podcast is its stories, and it's stories of ordinary people. One of my favorite episodes of the podcast is the story of this Black-White coalition in Memphis, Tennessee, that was able to stop an oil pipeline, which very rarely happens in this country. And the young leader of that was someone who actually worked at a Boston-based education organization. He was an assistant. And he was home, working from home during the height of the pandemic, at home where he grew in Memphis, and was able to begin to organize and lead this Memphis community against the pipeline, and had so much success. He's a natural born leader, ended up staying home, running for state legislature. And that young man is Justin J. Pearson, who's one of the Tennessee Three. Expelled by the right-wing supermajority for speaking out against gun violence and was put back in. Well, I hope and presume, win his special election again. So, really breaking down the activist companion guide. So, what is your activism style? Like, are you the person to stand up and speak, or are you the person to be organizing the meeting behind the scenes? And just sort of breaking down what it takes to organize and to be an activist, which I think should be a part of any civics instruction in schools. I mean, obviously, we need civics instruction in schools, but I think that kind of just playing pedagogy about how do you organize a rally, how do you find out who decision makers are, all of that is really important to teach young people. Do I know of any schools that are teaching making humans learn sort of away from the zero-sum worldview? I'm really good at pretending I know things that I know, and now I'm going to say I really don't, not because I don't think it exists or anything like that, but I haven't, specifically looked at that, and I don't. I know that as we have seen more admissions committees at higher education, start to want to articulate what actually makes a good graduate, right? I'm just reading a holistic admissions program at a nursing school, Columbia Nursing School, right? And they had to say, okay, well, what actually makes a good nurse, right? Is it the standardized test scores and the grades? Or is it these qualities, right? Is it grit? Is it patience? Is it critical thinking, right? And so having to name what makes a successful person in the world as a sort of incoming admissions criteria, as well as things to begin to educate towards, I've seen be a fruitful practice, right? Because it's very rarely, zero-sum thinking is what makes you a successful XYZ, right? Because we know we need to collaborate. We know that that's how you succeed. You need to lead people, right? I don't know. Solidarity dividends, zero-sum thinking.
Ending structural racism.
In schools. Okay, that narrows it a little bit. One thing I will say, broadly, there's a document that didn't get a lot of attention, or the attention that it should have, which was a policy agenda put up by the Movement for Black Lives at the height of the organizing. And then it was put into legislation, model legislation called the Green Act. It's just like works, it's like, what do they want, right? Like actually people did some work. It's good to look at it and see what would this look like. It was the Breathe Act is the name of the legislation. The Movement for Black Lives Policy Agenda is the report. Or if you Google that, you'll find what the report is called. I do think obviously we need to de-link the racist property evaluation system with school funding. Right? I mean, that's like fundamental number one. We've had, it's not the case in every state anymore, but overall, the most recent numbers I've seen is that, there's a $23 billion funding gap between majority of color and majority white school districts across the country. We need to look back at decisions that were made in various eras of highly contested, racial dividing lines about how we draw the school districts in the first place, right? Because not only that, is that majority of color school districts are often bigger because white school districts, make it so small, right? To make sure that, it's like a very small number of people who are pooling their resources to educate their own children. Obviously, I do think that, the history that you spoke of, Nick, that makes a career ladder and living wage jobs for everyone in the, the paraprofessionals and the educators of all kinds in the administration. So many young people of color do not see themselves reflected at the top of the classroom, at the top of the school, and that matters. It really matters. So those are just a couple of things, right? We've seen obviously a lot of work on the school to prison pipeline and discipline, disciplinary codes in schools that, overly punish Black boys and girls, and those need to be, revised, and we need to also recognize that we all carry biases, and that an unexamined heart and unexamined patterns of behavior is most likely to be perpetuating biases, from whatever position of power you may have, out of the classroom or whatever it is. And so that has to be addressed as well.
I hate to be in my role as a moderator, be the one to end this, but we are after 5. And I know we have limited time for Heather. Let me quickly also extend thanks to Ricardo and all of the MTA staff who made this possible. Thank you so much also to the Brookline Educators Union for hosting us here, for all of the volunteers who made this possible.
The custodial staff that set this room up.
Custodial staff. So many people working on this. Thank you to all of you for sharing your wisdom and your questions, and most of all, thank you. Yes, there will be books to be signed down here. Also, please do pick up your yellow cards and help us send messages to the Brookline School Committee. You see people going around with boxes to collect those.